A section. The hiss of the bus's air brakes was the sound of a world ending. For Staff Sergeant Elias Vance, it was the sound of a beginning. The acrid smell of diesel and hot rubber filled his lungs, a harsh perfume he welcomed because it was not the smell of sand and cordite. He swung his olive-drab duffel bag from the overhead rack, the weight of it a familiar ache in his shoulder. It felt impossibly heavy, heavier than it had any right to be, packed as it was with nothing more than worn uniforms and the few keepsakes that had survived 3 tours. He knew the real weight wasn't in the canvas bag, but in the 10 years it represented. 10 years of heat, dust, and the constant, grinding tension of a war that had forgotten how to end. A section. He stepped down onto the wet asphalt of the Oak Creek bus depot. A light, persistent drizzle was falling, the kind that made the world seem clean and new. It beaded on the sleeves of his civilian jacket, a stark contrast to the oppressive, baking sun that had been his constant companion for so long. He stood for a moment, just breathing. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke, the smells of home. A tightness in his chest, one he hadn't even been aware of, began to loosen its grip. A section. The plan was simple, rehearsed 1,000 times in the silent, lonely hours of the night. A surprise. Sarah, his wife, thought he wasn't due back for another 2 weeks. He pictured her face, the initial confusion melting into shock, then into that radiant smile that could light up the darkest corners of his memory. He'd walk the 2 miles to their little house on Chestnut Lane, just as he had on his first leave all those years ago. He wanted to feel the ground under his feet, to see the familiar landmarks, to let the reality of his return sink in one step at a time. A section. He started walking, his boots making a soft, rhythmic sound on the slick sidewalk. Past Miller's Hardware, its window display of shiny new lawnmowers unchanged. Past the old sycamore tree in the town square, its branches reaching like skeletal arms into the gray sky. Everything was just as he had left it, a perfect, preserved diorama of the life he fought to protect. It was quiet. So profoundly quiet. The absence of shouting, of engines roaring to life, of the distant, percussive rhythm of conflict, was a silence so deep it felt like a sound in itself. A section. He carried the duffel like a shield, a physical manifestation of the soldier he had been. But with every step closer to home, he felt that identity sloughing off, replaced by the man he was before, a husband, a neighbor, a man who belonged to this specific place on earth. His heart hammered a nervous, joyful beat against his ribs. He was almost there. The anticipation was a physical thing, a sweet ache in his throat. A section. He turned the corner onto Chestnut Lane. And stopped. The world tilted on its axis. A section. Something was wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. His house, their house, stood at the end of the lane, but it looked like a stranger. The lawn he had once meticulously cared for was a thatch of brown and unruly green. The cheerful blue shutters he and Sarah had painted one sunny Saturday were faded, one hanging slightly askew. A layer of grime clouded the windows, making them look like vacant eyes. It was a house that hadn't been loved. A section. A cold dread, metallic and familiar, trickled into his veins. This was the feeling he got before an ambush, the instinct that screamed of a hidden threat. He forced his legs to move, his boots suddenly heavy as lead. He walked up the cracked concrete path, his eyes scanning, assessing. Overflowing mailbox. A small pile of yellowed newspapers on the porch, soaked through by the rain. A section. He reached the front door, his hand trembling slightly as he pulled his house key from his pocket. The key he'd carried on his dog tags through firefights and long patrols, a tiny metal promise of return. He slid it into the lock. It wouldn't turn. He tried again, jiggling it, his breath catching in his chest. It didn't fit. The lock was new. A section. His military training took over, smothering the rising panic with cold, hard procedure. This was no longer a homecoming. This was an infiltration. He was no longer a husband. He was an operative assessing a compromised location. He moved silently around the side of the house, his senses on high alert. He checked the windows. The latch on the small bathroom window was loose, a vulnerability they had always meant to fix. He pried it open with his pocketknife, hoisted himself up, and slipped inside with a practiced silence that felt obscene in this place. A section. He landed softly on the bath mat. The air inside was stale, cold, and utterly still. A thick coat of dust covered every surface, sparkling in the dim light filtering through the grimy window. He moved from the bathroom into the main hallway. His heart, which had been hammering with anticipation just minutes before, now felt like a block of ice in his chest. A section. The house was empty. Completely empty. A section. Not just empty of people. Empty of life. The furniture was gone. The rugs were gone. The curtains were gone. All that remained were pale rectangles on the walls where their pictures had once hung. He ran a hand over the wall in the living room, over the faint, ghostly outline of their large wedding portrait. Sarah, laughing, her head thrown back. Him, stiff and proud in his dress uniform. Erased. A section. He walked through the vacant rooms, each silent footstep an echo in a tomb. This wasn't the house of a woman who had moved. This was the house of a life that had been systematically dismantled, scrubbed clean. In the kitchen, a single piece of junk mail lay on the dusty floor. It was addressed to current resident. He felt a wave of nausea, his legs suddenly unsteady. He leaned against a wall, the cold plaster seeping through his jacket, and slid to the floor. The duffel bag thumped down beside him, its weight finally feeling real. He was home, but there was no home here. He was a ghost in the ruins of his own life. A section. He didn't know how long he sat there, adrift in the silent, empty space. Eventually, the cold seeped into his bones, forcing him to move. There was one person who would know. One person who saw everything on this street. He picked up his duffel, left the house through the back door, and walked across the soggy lawn to the neighboring property. A section. Mr. Henderson was in his garage, tinkering with an old radio, just as Elias knew he would be. The old man looked up as Elias's shadow fell across the doorway. His face, a roadmap of 80 years, registered confusion, then disbelief. His hands, stained with oil and solder, fell to his sides. A section. Elias? The name was a fragile whisper. Son, it can't be. A section. It's me, Mr. Henderson, Elias said, his voice raspy. A section. The old man took a stumbling step forward, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and horror. My God! We all thought you were dead. We buried you. A section. The words hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. Buried him? What are you talking about? A section. The men in uniform, Henderson said, his voice trembling. They came to the door. Told Sarah you were gone. Killed in action. We had a service, son. The whole town came. They gave her the flag. He pointed a shaky finger toward the local cemetery. There's a headstone up there with your name on it. A section. Elias felt the floor drop out from under him. Declared dead. A mistake. A terrible, catastrophic mistake. Sarah, he choked out. Where is she? What happened to the house? A section. Henderson's face clouded with a deep, sorrowful pity. She wasn't right after that, son. Not right at all. She broke. Your brother, Caleb, he stepped in. Said he was taking care of things. Sold the house a year or so ago. Said he was moving her somewhere she could get help. The old man couldn't meet his eyes. He handles everything for her now. A section. Caleb. His younger brother. The one he'd always protected. A cold fire began to burn in Elias's gut, a controlled rage that was far more dangerous than any flash of temper. Where does he live? A section. The address Mr. Henderson gave him was in the new development on the other side of town, the one with sprawling houses and manicured lawns. As Elias drove his rental car through the pristine, winding streets, the image of his own neglected home burned in his mind. The contrast was a slap in the face. He pulled up to a 2-story brick colonial that was easily 3 times the size of his old house. A new luxury sedan sat in the driveway. His brother was doing well. A section. He didn't bother with the doorbell. He used the butt of his fist, pounding on the heavy oak door until it was wrenched open. Caleb stood there, dressed in a cashmere sweater and slacks. His face, softer and fuller than Elias remembered, went slack with shock, the color draining from it until it was the shade of ash. A section. Eli, he stammered, his voice a strangled squeak. No. You're dead. A section. Reports were exaggerated, Elias said, his voice dangerously low. He pushed past his brother into the marble-floored foyer. We need to talk, Caleb. About my wife. About my house. About my life. A section. Caleb stumbled back, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape route. Eli, I don't understand. They told us, there was a ceremony. A section. I was a prisoner, Caleb. For 18 months. They got it wrong. Now, you're going to tell me what happened. You're going to tell me everything. A section. They sat in a cavernous living room filled with expensive furniture that looked like it had never been used. Caleb, trembling, began to speak. He recounted the day the officers arrived, the devastating news, Sarah's complete and utter collapse. She just shattered, Eli, he said, his voice thick with a self-serving piety that made Elias's skin crawl. She wouldn't eat. She wouldn't talk. She'd just sit and stare at the wall. The doctors said it was a severe depressive episode, complicated grief. They said she wasn't capable of making decisions for herself. A section. This was the part of the story that grew murky, where Caleb's gaze would falter. He explained how he had petitioned the court for power of attorney. For her own good, Eli. To protect her. The house was too much for her, too many memories. The bills were piling up. I sold it to create a fund for her care. Everything I did to help her. A section. A fund for her care, Elias repeated, his voice flat. He gestured around the opulent room. Looks like a pretty healthy fund. A section. Caleb flushed. This is from my business. It took off. It has nothing to do with. A section. Where is she, Caleb? Elias cut him off, the question sharp as a bayonet. You said you moved her somewhere she could get help. Where? A section. His brother hesitated, wringing his hands. It's a facility. A quiet place. It's called Northgate Meadows. It's for the best. She's safe there. A section. Safe, Elias echoed. The word sounded like a lie. He had spent 10 years of his life understanding the difference between safety and confinement. You buried me, Caleb. You sold my home. And you locked away my wife. You erased me. A section. I grieved you. Caleb cried, tears of self-pity welling in his eyes. We all did. I had to pick up the pieces. What was I supposed to do? A section. Elias stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor. He looked down at his brother, at this weak, grasping man who had built a comfortable life on the foundations of his and Sarah's tragedy. The soldier in him, the man forged in violence and loss, wanted to dismantle him. It would be easy. But as he looked at Caleb's pathetic, crumbling facade, he realized something. Vengeance was a luxury. It was a distraction. The mission had changed. It wasn't about punishing his brother. It was about finding his wife. A section. He left without another word, leaving Caleb weeping in his stolen palace. The drive to Northgate Meadows was a journey into a different kind of hell. It wasn't a hospital. It was a warehouse for the broken and the forgotten, a low brick building set far back from the road, surrounded by a chain-link fence. The air inside smelled of bleach, boiled vegetables, and a profound, lingering sadness. A section. A weary-looking nurse directed him to the common room. It was a large, sterile space with linoleum floors and pale green walls. A handful of residents sat scattered in worn armchairs, staring at a television that played a mindless game show. And in a corner, by a window that looked out onto a patch of brown grass, sat a woman. A section. His breath caught in his throat. It was Sarah. But it was a version of her he had never seen, a faded photograph of the vibrant woman he held in his memory. Her hair, once a rich auburn, was dull and streaked with gray. She was painfully thin, her shoulders slumped forward in her drab, institutional robe. Her eyes, those beautiful green eyes that had once sparkled with life, were vacant. They stared out the window, but he knew they weren't seeing anything. A section. He approached her slowly, his boots silent on the linoleum. Every instinct told him to run to her, to hold her, to shake her back into the world. But he knew that the man who had stormed Caleb's house could not be the man who approached her now. He needed a different kind of strength. He needed patience. A section. He knelt beside her chair. "Sarah," he said, his voice gentle. A section. Her head turned slowly. Her eyes drifted over his face without recognition. They were the eyes of a stranger. He felt his heart break all over again, a clean, sharp fracture. A section. "Sarah, it's me," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's Elias. I'm home." A section. He reached out and took her hand. It was cold and limp in his. She didn't pull away, but she didn't respond. He stayed there, kneeling on the cold floor, holding her hand and looking into her empty eyes. This was the real battlefield. Not the dusty plains of a foreign country, but this silent room, this chasm of loss and trauma. His brother hadn't just taken her money, he had taken her soul and locked it away where no one would find it. A section. A flicker of something moved in the depths of her gaze. A question. A memory trying to surface. Her lips parted, and she spoke for the first time, her voice a dry, unused rustle of leaves. A section. "Elias," she whispered. She said his name not as a greeting, but like a word from a dream she couldn't quite remember, a ghost story she'd been told long ago. Then the flicker was gone, and her eyes went vacant again. A section. But it was enough. It was a starting point. It was a sign of life in the rubble. He squeezed her hand gently. "I'm here, Sarah," he said, his own tears finally falling, tracing paths through the grime on his face. "I'm here now. And I'm not leaving." A section. The weeks that followed were a new kind of war, fought not with weapons but with lawyers and doctors and infinite, painstaking patience. Elias moved into a small, furnished apartment, a sterile box that he slowly began to make his own. He hired the best lawyer in the state, a sharp, compassionate woman who saw Caleb's fraudulent power of attorney for the crime it was. The legal battle was swift and brutal. Caleb's empire, built on a foundation of lies, crumbled to dust. A section. But Elias found his victory was hollow. The real fight was at the new facility, a bright, caring place he'd moved Sarah to the moment he had legal authority. He spent every day with her. He brought photos, playing cards, her favorite brand of tea. He read to her from books of poetry they had once loved. He talked to her for hours, filling the silence with memories, with stories of his time away, with plans for a future he refused to believe was lost. A section. Some days, she was completely lost to him, her eyes distant, her body present but her mind a million miles away. On those days, he simply sat with her, his quiet presence a promise. Other days, there were flashes. She would smile at a memory he shared. She would ask a question about his day. These moments were oases in the desert, glimmers of the woman she had been, proof that she was still in there, fighting her own war to come home. A section. 3 months after his return, he sat with her in the facility's small, sunlit garden. She was holding a warm mug of tea in her hands, a little more light in her eyes than there had been the day before. She had been quiet all afternoon, but it was a comfortable silence now, not an empty one. A section. You know, she said suddenly, her voice clearer than he'd heard it in weeks. I always hated that crooked shutter on the old house. A section. Elias's heart leaped. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. I know. We were supposed to fix it that weekend. A section. Yes, she said, and she turned to look at him, really look at him. For the first time, he saw not a ghost, not a memory, but his wife. The recognition was clear, the connection solid. We were. A section. She reached out and placed her hand over his. Her skin was warm. Thank you for coming back, Elias. A section. There was nowhere else to go, he said softly. A section. He looked at their joined hands, then out at the horizon. The weight of his duffel bag was gone, replaced by a different kind of burden, one he chose to carry. It was the weight of shared healing, of a love being patiently rebuilt from its ruins. His old mission was over, the one that had sent him to the other side of the world. He understood now that his return wasn't the end of his service. It was the beginning of his true and lasting duty. He was home, and for the first time in a very long time, he knew exactly what that meant.